You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 13th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
It is 3 a.m. in Pyongyang, 2100 in Doha, 1800 here in London, and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That is the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Could this be the week that Gaza gets a ceasefire? Could a Zuckerberg-Musk-Trump alliance take on Europe? And have Americans forgotten how to throw a non-virtual party? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests, Julie Norman and Nina Dos Santos, will discuss the day's biggest stories, and we'll hear from Monocle regular Charles Hecker about his new book on the troubles of doing business with Russia. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm Chris Chermak. I'm joined today by Julie Norman, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at UCL and co-director of the UCL Center on U.S. Politics, and Nina Dos Santos, International Broadcast Correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. Hello to you both.
Hello. Hello.
We have decided in this office, which I think many frankly have, that it is too late to wish Happy New Year's, at least formally, because we're now into the second week. But I will ask you what you're up to over the holidays. Nina, you were telling me earlier that you're not necessarily a fan of holidays.
Well, you've just disappointed me because I was just about to wish you Happy New Year. I'm going to go for it. You know
Let's
what?
just
Break
go
the
for
rules.
it. Happy New Year. Let's
both.
do it.
Yeah, I'm a committed and recognised workaholic, and I am the Grinch who steals Christmas each year because I absolutely hate holidays. I just cannot get into the swing of it. 4 days is enough for me, even when it's sunny. And so I am quite happy to be back to the grind this week.
Well, we are excited to have you back here. That's all I can say. What more is there to say when there's a holiday Grinch in the studio? We're very excited.
It's a great disappointment to my family, of course, because I do have a 7-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a long-suffering husband who love holidays. But I'm quite happy for it all to be over. It felt quite long this time.
Julie, is there a part of you that's similar, or were you celebrating the holidays? You were back in the U.S.
I was happy, man. I mean, give me the holidays. I'll take Nina's. Just like pass him over. Just do the swap or something. No, I was home in the U.S. In the D.C. area, so I was in Washington for a couple of days and got to see all the pre-inauguration happenings as Washington gets ready for the next new phase.
What was the mood in the air?
I mean, I would say it's pretty glum, I guess you could say, in D.C., and a sort of sense of resignation these days. It'll be interesting to see after the inauguration what the mood is like. There's just kind of this like slouching towards it sort of atmosphere right now.
It is a strange slouching, yeah, absolutely. And we will be talking about that more on these shows, I'm sure. But we will start today in Gaza because this could be the week for a ceasefire, though we have heard this many times before. Talks in Doha have been yielding promising results, and Qatar says it has given a final draft to both sides. The proof, as always, is in the pudding, however, as it's not just about reaching a breakthrough between negotiators, but then also selling that breakthrough to the skeptics on either side. Julie, we'll start with you on this. The White House has just been briefing. It is sounding promising. There is a certain deja vu all over again about all of this, but is there something different in the air?
Well, there is, Chris. I mean, I do think we're right to still be very cautious in our optimism. We have gotten to this point many times over the last months, and it has not gotten over the line. And I think it's very important to remember that it's close, but there are still many details to be figured out. What is different, quite honestly, is simply the de facto ticking clock of the inauguration, the fact that Trump is going to be having his new administration start next week, and that has been seen as a sort of deadline. I would note both administrations have had envoys involved in this latest round, so the Biden and Trump administrations. But there is a sense from leaders in the region that if it's going to happen, this is really the push to make it happen, and everyone's been leaning their shoulders in. But as you noted, the question is really when it goes back to the parties, and from my opinion, there's still some very clear sticking points that have held it back in the past. Most notably, is this a pause or is this a definitive end? And Israel and Hamas have never been able to agree on that.
Well, just to follow that up quickly, Julie, I mean, especially on the Israeli side, that's often, well, at different points, it's been different sides that have been the most stuck in trying to sell it. At this point, it probably is more on Israel's side. How does Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, try to sell this? Because he has anger and frustration on either side, whether it's members of his cabinet from the far right or protesters and families of hostages on the left, if you will.
Well, that's true. I would say there has been much pressure on Netanyahu from various parts of the spectrum in Israel to get the hostages released. So I think at least the first phase of this proposed ceasefire, it's kind of a staged approach. There is a lot of support for getting those hostages home. Where it's trickier is the more right-wing elements of the government and the state who see this as surrender, as a giving in. And again, this idea of if it was actually a promise to end the war, there are many, I think, who would, push back at that. But right now, more of the public sentiment, the public protests, et cetera, are around getting the hostages released.
There is a time element to this, as Julie said, Nina, with Donald Trump's administration coming in, and we are seeing this kind of big international push as a result. The U.S. envoys from both administrations that are there, the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy also has been there. Do you get the sense the international community, particularly the US, I suppose, is just putting pressure on both sides to finally reach a deal at this point? And do they have leverage?
Yes, for sure. But it doesn't seem as though we know as yet exactly which element is going to move the dial. That's the big mystery, isn't it, at this hour? Probably because elements of the right-wing part of Netanyahu's government that could torpedo him at any time, like, for instance, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, have made it very clear that they don't want a cessation of fighting as a condition for the hostages being released. And then there is, again, some question marks among the family members of who exactly will be on those hostage lists. Previous lists that have been circulated appear to be obsolete because there's some question marks over whether or not the names of the people on those lists, whether those people are still alive at this point. So I think there's still a lot of question marks over the exact detail and the contours of any particular deal. But you're right to say that, yet the pressure is on. Donald Trump has made it very clear that he has said, quote unquote, before I take office, before the inauguration, I want to see those hostages released. And he's definitely made that point quite clearly to Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been waiting a long time for Donald Trump to come to office because he feels that he'll have more favourable terms with him.
Is there something different, Julie, about the way that the Trump administration, as it is now sort of involved, might be handling this? Or is it purely about the fact that Donald Trump is coming into office and he's sort of set this deadline of his inauguration?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, Netanyahu does want to stay on the good side of Trump, so to speak, and getting the war wound down as he sees as part of that. But I think some of it that needs to be considered is, what Trump is sort of promising in exchange for this. I mean, we don't know for sure, but much of the region is interlinked with these conversations, and Netanyahu and much of his government have been eyeing the West Bank even more than Gaza in recent years. And it would not surprise me or other observers if we saw, Trump greenlighting annexations of certain parts of the West Bank or ensuring some kind of continued Israeli presence in Gaza, things that the right wing has wanted. So that's where my attention is right now.
Do you imagine he's actually selling it that way? Would Netanyahu be saying to sort of the right wing and government that, look, give me the ceasefire now because you'll get other things down the line?
I could definitely see some, some behind the scenes discussions. I mean, the Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, other members of the Israeli government have been very clear on what they want. I mean, none of these things are secrets. And so Trump has been putting people in place who are very pro-settlement, who are very much in line with this. And so to me, the writing is very much on the wall.
And if I can just jump in, Trump has made it very clear that he backs them up to a certain extent in his nomination of ambassador to Israel in the form of Mike Huckabee, who has, on previous visits to Israel, made clear those exact points that he thinks that the West Bank should be territory that should be annexed, he says.
And Nina, I do wonder, beyond the US as well, if we look at Europe, if there is a ceasefire that does come into place, how does Israel, particularly, I suppose, begin to repair its relationship with the international community and with Europe in particular?
Oh, that's a big question. It's a very long one, and it's one that'll involve many different conversations with different parties that start off from completely different points of view, don't they? Take, for instance, Germany, that's had its very staunchly supportive stance of Israel. It's going to have a new government in a few months' time, or less than a few months, maybe a month and a half's time. And France may well have a new parliament come July if things carry on as unstable as they are at the moment with its very weak government. So there's lots of moving parts. And I think for the moment, though, as we've seen over the last couple of years and also over the years before, Benjamin Netanyahu probably is more focused on his own political survival and keeping together his difficult coalition before he starts embarking on those conversations.
Julia, final word on that?
And just as I think Netanyahu knows, if he has the U.S. still on his side, the relations with Europe just don't, frankly, matter as much if he knows he has Trump in his back. So,
and just as a final word on Netanyahu himself, Julie, if you were to cast your crystal ball here, if there is a ceasefire, does Netanyahu continue to survive in government?
I believe that he will. He is very, he usually finds a way, and I don't think he will agree to one unless he knows there is a way. And we've already heard some opposition members saying they'd give him a safety net if he agrees to the ceasefire.
Well, let's move on now to Ukraine, which says it has captured 2 North Korean soldiers. For Ukraine, the capture offers clear evidence that North Korea and Russia are inextricably linked, and Volodymyr Zelensky is hoping to leverage that by getting Ukrainian prisoners of war from Russia in exchange. Add to that the fact that Iran and Russia's leaders will close a strategic partnership later this week. And it does feel like the battle lines between the West and Russia, Iran and North Korea have now quite somewhat officially been drawn. Nina, I'll start with you on this. How symbolic, I suppose, is North Korea's participation, materially or symbolically? How much has North Korea's involvement really changed this war for you?
I think it is quite significant because it internationalizes the war. It also crystallizes that sort of axis of autocracy with countries like Russia, having to rely on North Korea, heaven forbid, a much poorer country that was very much kind of not even the junior partner, the very minor partner for Russia many years ago for munitions, for help, for manpower. But also North Korea gets something out of this as well, and that is learning how to do warfare in today's age, which is largely things like drones, using technology. That's one of the reasons why North Korea has sent its troops here to Ukraine, because Ukraine is a kind of new battlefield of how future wars are going to be fought. And North Korea, in fact, has turned up. If you read dispatches from many Ukrainian soldiers, they say, well, actually, they fight in very rudimentary fashion. They're only armed with very rudimentary arms, but they will be learning soon. And so that's one of the reasons why North Korea has gotten involved here. And as I said before, it internationalizes things. What's crucial about these 2 soldiers having been captured is that previously it's been quite difficult for the Ukrainians to capture North Korean soldiers as proof of their involvement because, sadly, they're targeted by their own forces and killed before they ever get into enemy hands.
And South Korea, at least, intelligence services claim that 300 North Koreans have already been killed and about, 2,700 or so injured. So there is a big element to that. And Julie, I do feel like, obviously, the Trump administration hangs over everything at this point, and it does hang over this as well. And I was curious for your kind of view on that, because one can make a little too much sometimes, I think, over this idea that Donald Trump favors all autocracies and loves sort of these strong leaders. But I do wonder what your opinion is of how he would react to this internationalization of the war. He had a bromance with Kim Jong-un, as it were, last time around. Will he continue to have that, or is the closeness with Russia something that causes problems for him?
Yeah, I think this will be very interesting to see. I would say that the world is obviously very different now in Trump's second term than it was in his first term. And, the closeness with Russia, kind of the ability to just slough off some of these other, conflicts or places just won't be an option this time around. I will say from the Republican Party, there has certainly been a lot of focus on linking some of the potential autocracies around the world, linking Iran, North Korea, Russia, even China. And I think there's a important debate in the U.S. and around the world right now with how much should we see these as kind of a network or a club, and how much is these just, normal kind of relations and states acting in their interests kind of beside each other. And so I think that's something that everyone's going to be watching. And for Trump, again, we never know exactly how he's going to handle any particular situation or any particular leader. But as Nina said, I do think just for the world seeing this internationalization of this conflict in such material, real terms, as we've seen it through these prisoners, it makes it real in a different way than when it just seemed like, support or a couple maybe, trades or deals or something. This is, boots on the ground is a different kind of level of involvement.
And how should Europe react to that, Nina, do you think? I mean, is there a way of looking at this that we are essentially at war with North Korea as well at this point?
Well, obviously, NATO hasn't been stepping foot inside Ukraine, not officially at least, as far as we know, even though long-range missiles can now be fired by the Ukrainians into Russian territory. So the boundaries are getting pushed and pushed further. But just going back to Julie's point about this sort of whether countries help each other out, I'd also argue that hybrid warfare really is the problem for Europe. It's not so much this type of boots on the ground warfare as yet. It's the kind of hybrid activities like, for instance, Chinese ships going around with their anchor and accidentally just dredging up internet cables inside EU territory and NATO territory now, because the Baltic Sea, which is where that last incident happened between Finland and Germany, that is now a NATO area after Finland and Sweden joined NATO, partly because of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So the issue that the EU is dealing with in terms of threats from other states and the concerning trend that they're seeing is cooperation between these states, particularly on hybrid activities for now.
It is interesting, Julie, when you talk about the internationalization of this and some of those debates within the Republican Party that are happening, because there are a couple of different wings of the Republican Party at this point, those that have kind of dismissed aid to Ukraine. And I do wonder if something like this will silence those voices somewhat, because you have maybe had also those voices, say, that are very tough on China and North Korea, but not so much on Ukraine and Russia. Will this kind of shift that debate?
It does. I mean, it complicates it a little bit. I think if those voices weren't swayed already by the collaboration between Russia and Iran, and Iran is kind of the bigger, is seen as the bigger threat by most Republicans and most in the U.S. I don't see this piece changing that calculation. But you're right that the party has a lot of different facets to it right now, with how they view foreign policy in general and how they view support to Ukraine in particular. But I do expect we'll see a push for winding down U.S. aid. And, part of that's from Trump himself, but just from the wider party as well.
And Nina, just a final word on this. You did mention NATO as well, and it's interesting that NATO has been somewhat involved in Asia. So I wonder if this impacts also the way that Europe thinks about conflicts within Asia.
I think they are concerned about conflicts within Asia, particularly China's recent skirmishes with the Philippines. That's bubbled up quite a lot recently. They're also quite concerned about that sort of impeachment of the president in South Korea after he appeared to sort of grab power in a coup. And they'll probably be looking at who might have been behind that, if there was any sort of foreign influence that might have created that situation. So I think they are, very concerned about events in Asia. But I think the problem is they've got elections again this year in crucial members like Germany, and they're very concerned about the threats of hybrid warfare, as I was saying before, and the disinformation battles, because, sorry to segue, I know later on we're going to talk about technology, but they're also extremely alarmed about people like Elon Musk undermining, the value of government and the value of security in this part of the world as well through technology, and that's not coming from a foreign hostile state, that's coming from America.
Well, to that point, we are segueing perfectly to our next item, Nina, because we did want to talk about the world of social media. We're starting to see a sort of grand plan perhaps emerging from Meta's boss, Mark Zuckerberg, because after last week he ended the third-party fact-checking in a bid to placate Donald Trump. Zuckerberg has now made clear what he wants in return. Europe has imposed billions of dollars in fines on tech companies over the past few years, and Zuckerberg is basically calling on Trump to rein in those pesky Europeans with their stiff anti-competition rules. So the two key questions now, I suppose, are whether Donald Trump will take up Zuckerberg's cause, and then whether Europe will actually meet Donald Trump on any of this if he does. And Julie, I'll start with you on the first part of that. Has Meta and Zuckerberg done enough to ingratiate itself with Donald Trump and get something in return?
That I'm not sure about. Obviously, Zuckerberg is leaning in that direction on many facets, the fact-checking, on DEI, et cetera. But I think for Trump more, it's this idea that he doesn't like regulation. He doesn't like globalist, internationalist sort of systems and regulations in particular. So I think if there's a chance to go after them or to push Europeans to negotiate on it as part of, say, tariff negotiations, I think something like that could be in the cards. At the end of the day, I don't think this is going to be number one on the agenda, so to speak, but I could definitely see it be brought into the mix just to lower regulations more broadly.
Well, and speaking of regulations, this is where someone like Elon Musk is, of course, brought in as well. And you can imagine an alliance between Musk and Zuckerberg on something like this. Nina, do you get the sense that Europe will actually have to respond to this, change some of its approaches to anti-competition if, say, Donald Trump were to threaten tariffs or there's simply more threats coming as a result of this?
Well, obviously the two things are being mentioned in sequence, aren't they? To knock heads together, essentially, to focus minds, because one of the biggest exports and big cultural exports that, much to our irritation here in the media sector, isn't regulated to the same extent as we are, is social media and big tech platforms. However, one thing Mark Zuckerberg, and by the way, can I just highlight the outstanding hypocrisy of Mark Zuckerberg over the last few months. He is somebody who did not appear to be towing the line at all with Donald Trump until all of a sudden he and all the other tech bros flipped. It started out with obviously Elon Musk earlier, then Jeff Bezos. We saw Jeff Bezos pulling an article, an endorsement of Kamala Harris ahead of the election in his paper, The Washington Post. Now, Mark Zuckerberg suddenly saying that we need a freer information space. He's also come out with an article, I don't know whether you've seen as well, that we need more masculine energy as well. So he's completely flipped and turned. And what he can't change is that European consumers do not like it. This is one of the biggest consumer markets in the world, more than 400 million people. Of course, the US platforms have been spending millions in Brussels for years. I've seen it firsthand to try and lobby the EU because the EU consistently slaps them down with fines. But the EU is probably one of the only bodies actually taking aim at these tech companies with some, toothy regulation. And it also speaks to the fact that the countries inside the EU want to regulate in a more stringent fashion. France is saying people shouldn't let their kids be online. Australia is saying that under 16-year-olds shouldn't be on these platforms. And Mark Zuckerberg can't go against that.
Julie, what have you made of some of what Nina was talking about there, this incredible shift that we have seen from Mark Zuckerberg and other CEOs, the tech bros in the US? I mean, we can't really get into their minds necessarily, but there's still this question, for me at least, is this something where they are cozying up to Donald Trump because he's coming into office, or are they kind of showing their true colors and this is what they believed and simply until now didn't feel comfortable to say it?
Yeah, like everyone said, there's a lot of conjecture. I mean, some is just, playing to the fact that Trump is the incoming president and wanting to ingratiate oneself and get the favors and whatnot. Some, I think, also is the fact that many simply felt many of the platforms were going too far to the left and were privileging too many progressive issues, and we're trying to kind of balance that out a bit more, but have kind of veered, the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. And then there's more just the question of, is this just really what their true colors have always been? And this is just kind of bringing it back to where it's wanted to be. But I think Nina's point is important. I mean, whether it's Europe or even the United States itself, you still have a consumer market at the end of the day. And, when, for example, when Bezos didn't run the endorsement of Harris, the Post lost, I think, over 200,000 subscribers or something, like very, very much. And I can see another exodus happening from Facebook, just as there's been a big exodus from Twitter. So at some point, this does, people vote with their feet to some degree on how they use social media as well.
There is at the same time another aspect of this, Nina, with Europe that I was curious because, yes, on the one hand, it's very interesting as you talk about consumers being kind of on the side of maybe Brussels on this. But is there an aspect where perhaps Europe has overplayed its hand on antitrust as well? Because it is always the one that takes on the big companies when other countries like the US do not. The US says a monopoly is fine, and Europe is the one to say, no, we're going to do something about this. I mean, they do play quite an outsized role.
Yeah, look, and having spent the last 20 odd years in the US media space, I always used to get asked, well, isn't that why Europe doesn't have any any multi-billion-dollar platforms in the technology space? Because every time anybody gets too successful, here comes the EU and knocks them back. Perhaps, but I do think there is an irritation with some of these, particularly these US platforms, because they've become big. They're not used to the regulation that the EU would require from anybody. Also, there's question marks over whether or not they pay the right whack of tax in some cases. And, there are concerns over the well-being of, children who are on these platforms. It's not just the EU, it's Australia, for instance, that's banned the use of some of these platforms for teenagers. So it isn't just an EU phenomenon, but they are the ones who have decided to take the bull by the horns, that's for sure. I was looking up the other day, they've got like 6 acts that are pertinent to companies like Mark Zuckerberg's already across the EU. And the UK, remember, is also has its own online safety act as well that it's rolled out recently. Having said that, in slightly contradictory fashion, today we've just heard the UK government say that they're going to hand over a lot of medical data to AI to allow it to be trained on that too. So giveth and taketh in the UK, but probably taketh more in the EU.
Well, finally, for our panel, we are going to talk about kind of the very opposite of what we're doing right here, which I like to think, despite our many listeners, is really just an informal gathering of 3 people in a room for a bit of togetherness and fun chit-chat. But a couple of recent studies out of the US have shown that more people are choosing to spend time alone than ever before. Call it a legacy of the pandemic, if you will, but it does also seem to reflect a change in habits. Apparently, only 4% of Americans attended any kind of social event on a random weekend in 2023. Nina, have we forgotten how to have fun?
I think we are forgetting how to have fun. Yeah, and I think also this concept of working from home is making it worse. That's the other thing, because, the economic pressures mean that lots of people are moving out of city centres, then they spend more and more time at home for work, and they have all these remote relationships, dare I say, via social media, but don't get me started on that again. And it's a shame because, I come from one of the most central parts of London, which is where we are at the moment, W1 slap bang in the middle. And so I've always grown up with a lot of activity around me, and I personally
have you
that
witnessed the exodus?
Angst, yeah, when the streets are quiet, But I do think, yes, people are getting quite used to being on their own. Whether that's good for us or not, I don't think so, because I've done many pieces in the past on how loneliness can be a real killer, particularly if you're older. So I think it's by design if you're younger, but not necessarily if you're older, which is when it can have some severe health consequences.
Julie, do you find, is there a place to take the other side for alone time? Are there moments where perhaps the pandemic did teach us at least that maybe there were social pressures that we always felt, that we were obliged to go to, the parties we had to go to, that we're now being a little choosier about?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there was a little dampening of the FOMO and a kind of like, it's okay to be an introvert, it's okay to stay in, that kind of thing. And I do think there's, and most, I think, research points this out, that there's a difference between, say, chosen solitude and like loneliness as like a chronic condition. And it's a tough question, I think, because I do think we see a shift, parts just the working from home and just people aren't, able to go out for drinks after work or whatever. And it's partly economic, too. I just think, people have been struggling to make ends meet for the last several years since the pandemic. And so the idea of going out and that kind of thing. So I'm curious with some of the data if people are meeting up in homes a bit more, or if that's actually is like, loneliness kind of spreading. But it's something that I think is not new. I think we've seen these kinds of things before, from when television first became a thing, then when cell phones. And so I think it's really interesting to look kind of the bigger history around it. But we do seem to be on that trajectory as a society. And it's something that I think it's important to pay attention to and try and understand where it's coming from, how much of it is sought and opted for, and how much of it is something that people are, grieving a little bit.
Well, just finally, I'll ask you both in turn. You can pick either end of this. Is there something you have learned you really enjoy doing alone? Or is there something you have discovered you can only do with other people? Nina.
I've been editing a film version of my podcast, and I have definitely discovered I can only do that alone. Partly because I've got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old and a cat and God knows what, and neighbours. And often I will be up all night till 4:30 in the morning enjoying my own company, editing alone. But, that's just by default rather than by design.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'll like play into my own stereotype. I always like doing yoga, and before the pandemic, I would always go to yoga classes. But during the pandemic, I started doing my own and actually got certified as a yoga teacher online during the pandemic. But I was just like, I actually really like this as like a solitary practice that now I do like every day instead of waiting for the class to roll around. So that's something that's a little bit different. But
with a video link or completely on your own?
Either one. Sometimes with a link, but sometimes just my own thing. But at the same time, I still do like going and being with other people and doing it as well. But that's something that just as a hobby, I was just like, I guess I can do this by myself. But most other things I was happy to get back to my friends for.
There is, as always, a balance. Nina Dos Santos and Julie Norman, thank you very much for joining us. And finally on today's show, with another round of stiff sanctions being announced on Russia, we are going to hand things over to another Monocle regular in Charles Hecker, former partner of Control Risks. Charles has written a book called Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia, which delves into the world of Western businesses and brands in the Russian climate. Charles sat down with Monocle's Georgina Godwin, who started by asking what the objective of Control Risks is.
One of the sort of jargony terms for it is intelligence. And intelligence can be a lot of different things. Intelligence is just information. And yeah, we were gathering information, and we're working in an opaque, initially, environment and having to do what we could to get that information. I wish I was a corporate spook. I wish it was that glamorous. This is a very heavily regulated industry, and we are held to incredibly high standards, not only by the law, but also by our clients who really don't want the spookery. They want reliable, verifiable, transparent information. And so from those early days of the kind of cloak and dagger image of it all, the industry moved on very, very quickly to becoming something that was ultimately mainstream and fairly vanilla.
I mean, so the questions they really want to ask are, should we invest here? Who's our competition? How best to go about this? What's our exit strategy? And so on. It's about doing business in sometimes tricky environments.
Exactly right. And so imagine in the 1990s, the world is globalizing. Companies are globalizing. And we have these things called emerging markets, which used to be basically third world countries, but had just been sort of rebranded. Third world countries are not investable. Emerging markets are very investable. And Russia was one of the biggest emerging markets in the 1990s. Companies had to go there. To not go to Russia in terms of shareholders and market and commercial opportunity, to not invest in Russia was almost seen as irresponsible because you'd be missing a huge opportunity. But everybody knew the politics were unstable. Early Russia was highly criminalized. I mean, there were literally people getting shot on the streets in Moscow, business people in business disputes. And so you can imagine these sort of publicly listed companies in New York and London and Paris and Frankfurt thinking, well, we've got to do business in this country, but it looks a bit terrifying from a distance. And so our role was essentially to sort of try to demystify Russia, to elucidate and enumerate the risks that it presented to companies who were really stampeding in kind of almost no matter what. But, we were trying to help them do this as safely as possible.
And that, of course, is really what your book's about. Zero Sum, the subtitle is The Arc of International Business in Russia. You were there at the beginning, you saw those companies come in, and now you're seeing them go out. And you've written about all of that through wonderful, wonderful personal insights. You've done, hundreds of interviews with people, all meticulously documented at the back in a huge notes section. But it's incredibly readable. We have all these wonderful stories about people who came in, and you go right back. I mean, you go back hundreds of years, actually, to the very first foreign investments in Russia, and you bring it right up to date. Tell me, though, about that switch from sitting in an office advising people about it to deciding that you were going to write a book.
So you're absolutely right to say that there was a beginning and an end to this story. And, I was there at the Stampede inbound and was there at the Stampede towards the exit. And that, to me, completed a story arc. I mean, good stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, good books need a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think we finally, even though the end is extremely messy, I think we finally have that story arc in Russia. And, I had been at Control Risks for something like 26 years when this was all happening, and it's a great company, and I enjoyed it enormously. But, there's a time for everything. And the combination of having served a long tenure in a professional services firm and then having this story essentially drop on your head, really sort of the light bulb went off, and I said, this is a story that needs to be told. It needs to be told soon. It needs to be told quickly. And, I might be in a good position to hammer this out.
I mean, and you say, you really make the point in the book that it was a gamble. It was always a gamble. And people went in knowing this. They went in knowing you're going to invest in this place. It's the Wild West. This is risk at its highest.
One of the things that I learned the most from in researching the book, and on the subject of the interviews, I think the timing was very good because a lot of people who were doing business in Russia had an awful lot to get off their chests. I mean, they really wanted to talk about their experience in going in, making tons of money, and getting out. But one of the themes that emerges from the books and one of the things that was most interesting to explore was this concept of risk and risk appetite. And companies that went into Russia had to have an enormous, in some cases, voracious appetite for risk. And, some companies were sort of shoot first, ask questions later. Let's jump into the market with both feet and we'll see what happens. Others did it with sort of baby steps and tons of due diligence reports and tons of market studies and lots of, sort of political overviews. But everyone who went into Russia assumed potentially corporate, reputation ruining and company ruining levels of risk. And it was a sort of month by month, year by year over this entire arc from the 1990s to just 2 years ago. It was this constant sort of calibrating of, how much risk is too much risk and how is the sort of risk and benefit equation working out.
That was Charles Hecker speaking to Georgina Godwin. His book, Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia, is published by Hearst and out now. Listen out for the full interview with Charles on Meet the Writers on Monocle Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panelists today, Julie Norman and Nina dos Santos. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis, researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nickel, with editing assistance by Steph Chungu. I'm Chris Termack here in London. Andrew Muller is back from his hiatus and hosting the Monocle Daily at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye from me, and thanks for listening.